Hello and welcome to Chapter 7 of A History of Spain. This is where we meet late Bronze Age warriors who sometimes realised that their weapons were less useful than their business sense. Wiping people out might be a lot less profitable than selling their wares to them. I'm David Beeson, and I made you two promises at the end of last week. The first was to talk about an Indo-European wave sweeping across the continent right into Iberia. Well, the first part of the title of this episode is 3 waves, so you can see I'm going to keep my promise 3 times over. But the title goes on, but no tsunami. And that's because my second promise was to do a little more myth busting. This week's myth to bust is the image I expect most of us conjure up in our minds when we hear about a wave sweeping across Europe, which is that of warriors on horseback with sword in one hand and maybe a torch in the other, putting the whole of the continent to fire and the sword. Well, as the initial sequence of this episode suggests, I hope, my intention this week is to show you that this wasn't always the case, and in particular that the experience of many in Iberia was probably quite different. Okay, let's get on with the waves. The first of these concerned the Urnfield people. I have to admit, when I first heard that name, I thought we might be talking about some strange place in Germany that I'd never heard of. But in fact, the name's much simpler than that. It's made up of urn and field. That's because the hallmark of this new culture was that instead of burying their dead, or at least the great and the good amongst them, under mounds of earth, as the previous peoples had done, they tended to cremate them, put the ashes in urns, and bury those urns in fields. Fields that would be really rather like cemeteries today. Now, these were people who lived across what is now Germany, eastern France, Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, and northern Italy. And they lived, rather like the people we were talking about last week, the Iberians, in fortified hilltop settlements. There was one obvious difference, though. In the Urnfield heartland, fortifications were usually built from earth, timber, and ditches, with wooden palisades crowning the ramparts. In Iberia, by contrast, we often find the massive stone walls that we talked about last week. Living in that kind of settlement rather suggests that the people within it expected to have to resist the attentions of outsiders not particularly well disposed towards them. As I pointed out last week, fortifications are never a sufficient defence. They need to be held by men with weapons, in other words by warriors. And the Urnfield culture set great store by its warriors, who formed an elite. That kind of elite becomes very hierarchical, and considerable authority is vested in the people at the top, who are usually warriors themselves, acting as chiefs. The high status of warriors is revealed in the fact that Urnfield society, which was very good at metalwork and other forms of production of high-quality goods, tended to put a lot of effort and a lot of skill into making the objects used by the warriors themselves. You get some fabulous swords, well decorated, great helmets, even as some Hungarian archaeologists discovered some absolutely fabulous greaves. A greave is a shin guard protecting the lower leg from knee to ankle. Today they tend to be used by sports people, but they're generally made of plastic. Wouldn't it be fun to see an international sports star of our days using the kind of skillfully shaped and beautifully decorated bronze greave that the Hungarian archaeologists discovered? There's no need for defence unless someone's doing the attacking, and the people attacking would be the same kinds of people as the people defending, in other words, warriors. They had a double role. They could be defending against raids one day and launching their own raids another. But that's not the only two roles they had. Since the Urnfield communities produced such wonderful products, somebody had to sell them, and one of the things Urnfield proved extremely good at was developing very long-range, very effective networks of commerce. Traders would set off from their settlements and travel sometimes great distances to sell their goods to other people. And who would be doing that trading? Well, if you're carrying valuable goods, it makes a lot of sense to have someone along that can protect you. What's more, it might be useful to have them there, heavily armed, not necessarily using their weapons, but nonetheless intimidating anybody who might feel inclined to resist your arrival in their village. That sounds like a job for warriors, doesn't it? Now here comes the clever step. If you're going to send warriors out with trading missions, and no doubt with a chief to organise and lead them, why would you bother to have a separate group of people going along with them to do the actual trading? The warriors could do that themselves. In other words, the very people in the Urnfield culture who might go raiding on behalf of their settlements were also the people who went trading on their behalf. They were raiders and traders. The message sent by the fact that the traders were also warriors might simply be, don't mess with us and we'll give you no reason to regret our coming amongst you. In fact, you might even go home with some highly desirable commodity with which you'll be very happy. That's what we call win-win. Well, to be fair, I don't know that they actually had an expression like win-win in whatever their language was, but I bet you they had the notion. Talking about language, it's not obvious what language these people spoke. A number of archaeologists have argued that they were pre-Celts. In other words, they were the seedbed from which the Celtic languages eventually emerged. And it's certainly true that the Celtic languages seem to have had their roots in the same kind of areas where the Urnfield people lived. The problem is that we know the Urnfield people only through the objects they left behind, and no one thought to leave little notes for us saying, "Us Celts? Don't be silly. They won't be around for some centuries yet." Or maybe the opposite. Of course we're Celts. We're speaking an early form of the Celtic language. So we don't know. It's possible that the Urnfield people were pre-Celts, and it's possible they weren't. And eventually, in about 1200 BCE, they reached Iberia, where they began trading with the people who would become the Iberians, the culture we talked about last week. They also moved up the Ebro Valley, and there they came into contact with existing Indo-European societies living in the central meseta of Spain. Now there's another potential myth here which we should dispel at once. The fact that the Urnfield people were Indo-Europeans and so were the people of the meseta doesn't mean that they would have greeted each other as long-lost brethren of the same people. On the contrary, the Indo-Europeans of Iberia had been there for between 1,000 and 1,500 years when the Urnfield people arrived. In that time, the language both in Iberia and in Central Europe, where the Urnfield people arose, would have evolved enormously from what was, undoubtedly, a common root. English and Spanish are both Indo-European languages, but I think you would need to be as acute as William Jones, the man who first came up with the notion of Indo-European languages, to spot the fact that they have a common ancestor if you didn't already know it. As far as both sides were concerned, trading between the Urnfield people and the people of the meseta of Spain was happening between foreigners. Now, as we've seen with the Phoenicians and Greeks trading down the eastern and southern seaboard of Iberia, trade brings influence with it. So how did this all work? Well, you had people from the warrior elite of the Urnfields showing up, carrying artfully designed and beautifully made weaponry, looking magnificent and martial, and carrying highly desirable goods. It's not hard to imagine that just as soon as villagers got over their initial fear of these characters, they might have felt considerable admiration for them. What you then get is a desire to emulate. People would want to be like them. It's not hard to believe that something like that happened, given that there seems to have been considerable influence exercised by these Urnfield traders. One of the things that got passed on to the population of Iberia, particularly in the northeast, was the custom of cremating the dead and burying them in urns. There were quite quickly urns being produced in Iberia too by the people who would become the Iberian culture. What's interesting though is that the Iberians, when they emerged as a separate culture, went a lot further. We talked at some length last week about that wonderful sculpture, the Dama de Elche. A 2011 paper whose lead author was Maria Pilar de Luxan demonstrated what many archaeologists had long suspected. The hollow at the back of the sculpture contained traces of human remains. It turns out that the sculpture was an urn, and it's by no means the only one. Another sculpture along the same lines, the Dama de Bertha, also contains such remains. In other words, the Iberians may well have been influenced by the Urnfield people to adopt the practice of cremation and burying in urns. But they'd also been moulded by the process that we saw last week. Archaeologists refer to as Orientalization, is the influence of people from the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically the Phoenicians and the Greeks. That gave them a different aesthetic. So instead of using plain urns, they used some extraordinary works of art to hold the ashes of their most distinguished cremated dead. What else might they have taken from the Urnfield people? Well, here's the thing, and this is really a personal view, and you can take it for what it's worth. I keep coming across statements such as, the Urnfield people influenced Iberian ceramics. And certainly I went hunting around looking for some attractive Urnfield material and found, for instance, a fine bowl with a geometric pattern. Now, it's not ceramic, it's bronze, but it's a bowl. I compared it with an actual ceramic bowl from the Iberian Peninsula, again with a geometric pattern with lines and abstract shapes, and if anything, I think the Iberian one is more complex and more sophisticated than the Urnfield one. So it looks like the Urnfield approach was adopted by the Iberians and taken further, rather like the handling of the urns. Except that it couldn't possibly have been that way. The ceramic bowl in the image I was looking at wasn't from the Urnfield times, it was about 1,000 years older. This suggests that while there may well have been Urnfield influences on Iberian ceramics, it does look as though there was something already being done well before the arrival of the Urnfield people, on which the Urnfield influence might have acted. They weren't innovating, though they may well have encouraged something that was already happening locally. We could say very much the same for the use of fortified hilltop settlements. I got pointed at the settlement at Els Vilars d'Arbeca, the northern part of the Iberian region, where the contact with the Urnfields was closest. Now, it's not actually a hilltop settlement, but it is surrounded by water, which I'm told was not that unusual. So, in effect, there were moats that were acting in the same defensive way as a hill. And it was fortified, but it's not fortified anything like the way the Urnfield people fortified. They used earthworks and ditches and wooden palisades. At Hallstatt they used thick stone walls, just like at La Yoma de Bechi, and before that in the Agaric settlements, and before that at Los Millares. In other words, to me at least, Hallstatt feels much more like an indigenous settlement, following well-established patterns locally, rather than something influenced by newcomers from elsewhere. We also know that the Urnfield people had a strongly ingrained warrior ethos. And we saw last week that one of the objects found at La Bastida de les Alcuses was a figurine of a warrior on horseback, suggesting that several centuries after the arrival of the Urnfield people, the same kind of warrior mentality had reached the southern parts of the Iberian culture region. But did it come from the Urnfield people? At about the same time, or just a little later than the Urnfield people came into contact with Iberians, a completely different culture in the west of the Iberian Peninsula, in what is now Extremadura, was producing what we now call warrior stellae. A stela is a slab of stone onto which a design has been carved. And the ones in Extremadura show swords and shields and spears and chariots and prestige status symbols. So there was obviously an indigenous warrior ethos developing in Iberia at much the same time as the Urnfield people arrived in the peninsula. What this all says to me is that the Urnfield people, rather than introducing innovations, may have simply encouraged an outlook that was already well established. They may have met an open door through which, once they were satisfied that they came to trade rather than to do them violence, the Iberians were only too happy to let them in. The Urnfield culture was, of course, only the first of the three that we were talking about. The next wave was the Hallstatt culture. It's called after the site where the culture's remains were first investigated in Austria. Where the Urnfield culture had produced a warrior elite led by chiefs, Hallstatt went one step further, turning their leaders into princes, aristocratic figures whose authority was no doubt passed on by inheritance. Their settlements, as at Ipf in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, include princely dwellings. Although cremation continued, such figures were often buried under mounds, as in earlier civilizations, and accompanied by highly valuable objects to underline their princely status. The Hochdorf burial in Germany, for instance, includes a bronze couch and expensive goods, some of which are of Mediterranean production, showing how far the trade networks extended and how much the princely figures were prepared to spend to display their wealth and authority. It's generally accepted that the Hallstatt influence reached Iberia in about 800 BCE, and it came through the same route as the Urnfield people, over the Pyrenees and up the Ebro Valley, though this time it extended further westward into the central plateau of the peninsula, the Meseta. What's truly striking, however, is not the evidence for their arrival, but the lack of evidence. There are significant settlements in Spain from the period, in particular the early part at least of Las Cogotas, but what's missing is any trace of princely dwellings, or the kind of tomb that was found at Hochdorf, or indeed of expensive products of Mediterranean manufacture. On the other hand, a significant development associated with the Hallstatt culture was the introduction of the use of iron in Iberia. It wasn't the Hallstatt people that invented it, it came from the Middle East. They were the first people in Europe to make extensive use of iron. Iron does require a major technological change, where bronze mostly had to be cast, in other words, melted and poured into moulds. Iron treated that way tends to be weaker. Instead, iron needs to be forged, that is to say, heated but not melted, and then hammered into shape. Think of a smith's work. Archaeologists have indeed found traces of the introduction of iron working into Iberia at about the time of the Hallstatt culture. What isn't clear, however, is how much that development actually owes to Hallstatt. On the contrary, it's fairly clear that the Iberian culture picked up ironworking from the Phoenicians. What's more, if you cast your mind back to episode 3, you may remember that well before the first contacts with the Phoenicians, there were Atlantic trading routes bringing tin in by sea to Iberia from what is now France or Britain or even further afield. Those networks never died, and there would have been traders arriving on the north and west coasts of Iberia, many of them doubtless influenced by Hallstatt culture themselves. There's no reason to assume that they would be any less well received when the locals realized that they were there as traders and not as raiders than their counterparts in the villages of the interior. They represent another route for the entry of ironworking and indeed other influences into the peninsula. It would have been helpful if someone from the period had got a message to us saying, "I'm a smith and I learnt my trade not from those ghastly characters coming in over the mountains to the north, but from my friends in the south living by that great body of salt water they're always talking about." Alternatively, he might have said, "It wasn't the characters from the south who taught me my trade, it was my brothers from the north and west of here." Sadly, no one thought of doing that, so we can only speculate as to how ironworking emerged in central Spain. Possibly it arrived by multiple routes to a peninsula that was something of a crossroads for cultures. But a princely culture and the working of iron weren't the only characteristics that marked the Hallstatt people. As I said before, we don't know whether the Urnfields were already Celts. The word Celt was introduced by those great namers of people, the Greeks, who refer to the Keltoi. It's not quite clear who they were using the word for, since they mentioned that they lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that's the Strait of Gibraltar, and therefore in Iberia, and at the source of the Danube, which is a heck of a long way away in Germany. Still, whether or not the Greeks were confused about the geographical location of the Keltoi, the word stuck and gave us the name for the people we now call Celts. Curiously, the word was first used by the Greeks in around 500 BCE, and the Hallstatt period ended in around 450. Now I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap here and leap forward to around 200 BCE, because that's about the time when some bronze plaques were made in a place called Botorita. They're covered in inscriptions, and the thing about those inscriptions is that they're in a language that is undoubtedly Celtic. Now, if people are writing Celtic in 200 BCE, it's most unlikely that they only started using the language in 201 BCE. Botorita is in that part of Spain inhabited by a people which the Romans called the Celtiberians. The name Celtiberian may suggest that they were a mix of Celts and Iberians. Most archaeologists now agree that they were in fact a people of central Iberia that began to speak Celtic languages and adopt Celtic customs. The Botorita inscriptions are not the only ones within the Celtiberian region. There are indeed other inscriptions from around the old Indo-European part of Spain, to the west and to the north. Some of them are in languages which may actually be Indo-European but not Celtic, but others undoubtedly are Celtic. What's more, this is all backed up by the fact that there are place names which are obviously Celtic in origin. The word Briga means hill or hill fort. We have Segobriga, which combines Briga with a word meaning strength, Segor. That's now Sailithes in the province of Cuenca. We also have Nertobriga, which combines Briga with another word meaning strength, Nerto, which is near Fregenal de la Sierra in Badajoz. There's Coimbriga, which is near Coimbra in Portugal. Then there's Segovia, which is still called that, and whose name presumably has the same roots as Segobriga. So there's rather a lot of these place names. I've only given a small selection of them here, and they cover quite a wide area of the Iberian Peninsula. That does rather suggest that there was widespread use of Celtic across at least the Indo-European areas, the Central Meseta, the North and the West, quite a while before the long inscriptions on the bronze plaques at Botorrita, which, for their part, displayed how completely, by then, the people there had mastered the languages. So the question is, how much earlier did they start to speak Celtic? Was it a century? Was it a couple of centuries? Was it 5 centuries? We know that the Greeks started to use the word Keltoi in 500 BCE. Now, for them to be aware of the existence of that people, you'd have to feel that they'd been around a while before that. The Hallstatt culture really came to an end at about 450 BCE. So it's just possible that Celtic was being spoken by Hallstatt people and that they helped introduce them into the Iberian Peninsula. But there's nothing conclusive to prove that either way. It's pretty obvious that we're never going to know unless and until archaeologists find quite a lot more evidence. And then there's another question, and I'm afraid I hate doing this. It's another one to which we don't have an answer. And that's, why was Celtic adopted in Iberia? There are other examples of new languages taking over from existing ones, but usually it comes after conquest and the establishment of a new system of government, of law and of commerce, which persuades people bit by bit, often over a few generations, to abandon their old language and adopt the new one. It would happen in Spain itself when Latin took over. It would not happen in England when French didn't take over despite the Norman conquests. So it's always a bit of a roulette to know whether a language is going to get established or isn't. And unfortunately, we really don't know why Celtic became the dominant language in the Central Meseta and the north and west of Spain. It's possible that it's to do with something that I mentioned earlier, which is emulation. These characters turned up, they looked great, they were dealing with wonderful products, and as I've been stressing again and again in the course of this episode, they weren't completely alien. They suggested ways of doing things that actually corresponded to ways that the people in the Iberian Peninsula already had been doing them for quite a time. It was more of the same. As I said before, it was knocking at an open door. So you get some pretty remarkable people who look great, who are doing things that you feel are good in themselves, but perhaps doing them you feel better than you do. Emulation would then drive you to want to do things the same way as they do. It's a bit like celebrity culture in our days, or indeed the way fashion moves, with trends being set and other people following them. Maybe that's what happened in Iberia. They liked what they saw and they decided to do it too. And therefore they adopted the language and the customs of the Celts that arrived, even though They didn't turn up in massive numbers, and they never conquered the place. But as I say, we don't know whether that's the case or not. All we can say with any kind of certainty is that the use of Celtic languages was widespread in the old Indo-European areas of Iberia by the 2nd century BCE. By that time, the third wave of influence from the east was well underway. That was the La Tène culture, which got going around 450 BCE and is called after the little village in Switzerland near the site where archaeologists first found traces of it. It differs from Hallstatt in that it has moved away from the princely model of structure. It's, if anything, even more warrior ethos based than Hallstatt, but it looks as though the fundamental structure was confederations of tribes or fortified towns, which archaeologists refer to as oppida, which is the plural of the Latin word oppidum, meaning town. They're often called castros in Spain. These warriors were indeed war makers, and in 390 BCE, the Celtic tribe known as the Gauls even sacked Rome, much to the irritation of the Romans. Doesn't look as though they used any great violence on entry into Spain, but they do seem to have had quite considerable influence. Indeed, you get a lot of oppida in Spain, some of them extremely attractive, many of them very distinctive. The Castro de Santa Tecla, or de Santa Trega in Galician, is an extraordinary example of one of these hill forts overlooking the Atlantic up in the province of Pontevedra in Galicia, in the northwest of Iberia. It's extremely unusual in its use of round houses, traces of which can still be seen on the site. In central Spain, in a region that would be the homeland of the tribe that came to be known as the Vetones, there's Ulaca, one of the biggest of the hilltop settlements, covering some 70 hectares, with monumental walls and gates, the remains of a remarkable tower, and even of a sanctuary with stone-cut steps leading down into it. Las Cogotas is another Veton site with spectacular monumental walls. These examples all seem to display the influence of La Tène views on settlement construction in Iberia, except in one respect. It's instructive to compare the fine masonry walls at the Bibracte La Tène site at Montbeuvray in Burgundy in France, with the massive walls that we see in the Spanish castros. They seem to reflect a much older indigenous tradition of monumental wall building that we've come across again and again in the preceding episodes. Las Cogotas is also the site where a remarkable sword was discovered, with a beautiful hilt decorated with curved lines. Think back to what we said earlier about the Urnfield bronze bowl with its geometric patterns using straight lines. It's something much more typical of La Tène culture and more generally of Celtic art to use curved lines and natural motifs like leaves and animals. The sword I'm talking about was found in a grave where it presumably marked the elite status as a warrior of the man buried there. We find similar decorations on other weaponry, such as shields, but also on ceramics. Other archaeological findings that struck me were a rather fine horse-shaped brooch from Numantia in the Celtiberian region, and a rather weird, if not downright ridiculous, piece of ceramics in the shape of an animal that I can't begin to identify. And when it comes to depictions of animals, the most famous of all are the berracos. These are large granite monuments, mostly scattered around the Veton areas of Iberia, though there are some in other regions too. And they seem to represent bulls, or sometimes boar, or sometimes pigs, and very occasionally bears. The most famous are the Toros de Guisando, the bulls of Guisando, but there are many others. So they made monumental sculptures of the very animals that they might have herded, or at least hunted, at the same time as they were reasserting themselves as a warrior culture. Does that ring any bells? Let's not forget that these were the descendants of the original Indo-European settlers of Iberia, the heirs of the Yamnaya people, and they had been warrior pastoralists of the Eurasian steppe. Warrior pastoralists. It almost sounds as though the Bretones and some of the other people of Indo-European Iberia were once more affirming their commitment to the warrior pastoralist culture, which perhaps had been a tradition unbroken for the more than 2 millennia since they'd been in the peninsula. Maybe it was being given a new lease on life by the impact of the La Tène Celtic culture. That may seem fanciful. I'm not sure it's implausible. So we've seen 3 waves breaking across Europe and eventually reaching Iberia. But as the title of this episode suggests, they never became a tsunami. They never simply swept away what was already there to replace it by something completely new. On the contrary, it feels to me as though those cultural waves encouraged or even boosted things that were already happening. One of the things to which that seems to have led was the increasing Celticization of the old Indo-European parts of the peninsula, above all the central Meseta, the north and the west. You see that in the increasing adoption of Celtic designs and also, of course, the use of the Celtic language. Going hand in hand with that was a re-emergence of an old and perhaps uninterrupted interest in and admiration for the old Yamnaya-style warrior pastoralist culture. One of the things I want to stress, and it's been really a message of this episode from the very beginning, is that most of this happened apparently without widespread violence. There's no evidence of a military invasion. There doesn't even seem to have been any kind of mass migration. There may have been a few individual migrants, but no swamping of the local population. On the contrary, it was all apparently a matter of trade and influence and basically peaceful. That's actually quite odd because the Celts were far from averse from doing some violence when they felt like it. That was something that the Romans and the people of some other places discovered to their cost when the Celts came visiting. But in Iberia, everything seems to have happened generally peacefully. And finally, I'd like to end with a small irony. With the adoption of Celtic across the Meseta and the north and west of the Iberian Peninsula, a large portion of the Iberian population was speaking an Indo-European language. It was one of the most successful and most extensive of European history. Now, the vast majority of the Iberian population, even today, speaks an Indo-European language. But it isn't Celtic. How that happened is something we'll start to look at next week. In the meantime, many thanks for listening.